A few weeks ago, I talked about this concept of the many selves that we have within us that we can use to interface with the world. These different avatars, if you will, that we pull up, these different personalities, this caretaker personality that fits the situation. Now I want to flip that on its head and talk about the many worlds in which we exist and interface with. And at the ultimate level, we are everywhere all at once. And we are experiencing the totality. On a relative level, where this body is located, where this little center is located, both physically and in virtual space, we are creating a world. And it's my job to kind of support and protect that world. And to be honest, I failed recently. I caught myself indulging in nostalgia. And it caused me to overlook things for a long, long, long time that would not have been overlooked had it not been for those feelings of nostalgia. And it caused me to really do some deep dive and seismic shifting, and help me become much more aware of where my limits are in this world. It caused me to really understand the whole concept of why monasteries have walls. My teacher would always say, monasteries have walls not to keep the monks in, but to keep everybody else out, because that allows a place, a sanctuary to exist for practice to take place, for sincere practice to take place. And that doesn't mean that mistakes don't happen. It doesn't mean that all the monks living inside are absolutely perfect and they're better than everybody else. Not at all. What it means is that there's an agreement that happens in that community, that everybody there is pointed in the same direction, that we all want the same thing, that we're all willing to abide by what Buddha called the 5 precepts. So when we're looking at the walls that we make within our world that we live in, we each have, so let me back up a little bit. So this concept of worlds within worlds within worlds. I have a world that I live in, and that I have invited all of you to come live in with me. But in order to sustain that world, in order for it to thrive and remain a place of purity and growth and light, then there has to be certain agreements. Mm-hmm. And this happens in sorry, go away. This happens in each of our lives. Like each of you has your own world, which you are the ultimate authority. You decide who gets to be in that world and where the boundaries are and how they will be enforced. And that is entirely up to you. And then your worlds will interface with other people's worlds, and their worlds will interface with other worlds. And so we have all these worlds coming together. And there's a lot of crossover. So it's not my job to control your world, but it is my job to control my world. And in my world is populated by people who are interested in awareness and kindness and growth, and they make a commitment to that. And I think the 5 precepts really sum it up. And I'm not saying that everyone, including myself, does not 100% live up to the 5 precepts, which, if you don't know what those are, the way I would describe them is we don't murder. We take only what is given. We are honest, which is essential to humility. We don't escape through intoxicants. And we don't misuse our sexual energy. We don't use it to manipulate and control other people. So in the world in which I live, the rules in which I try to live by are those 5. And it's interesting as I interact, as a teacher in this world, because of course people are just learning these things. They might not know how important honesty is. They might not see the connection that it has to humility, because if we're lying, even those little white lies, like we tell the telemarketer, oh, I'm busy eating, and really you're not, that creates a little bit of delusion. And that little bit of delusion spreads very easily. So as a teacher, I do my best to show through an example of my own life, and then when appropriate through correction, that, hey, maybe that's not okay that you're doing that. And if somebody's actually willing to learn, then they take that feedback and they look at it first and say, well, is that really what's going on? Because maybe I'm not seeing correctly. And we can have a discussion back and forth about it. And then we eventually reaffirm that, okay, this is the world we want to create. This is the world we want to live in. So yes, let's abide by these rules. And then there's sometimes something that my teacher also taught me is there's this ability for us to allow other people to ride on our karma. So what that means is we can actually elevate people out of their current situation and allow them to experience their full potential, or their potential up to that level. Like my teacher did this for me. He actually brought me to this amazing, gorgeous resort in St. Bart's in the Caribbean, where we got to stay in the owner's villa. So there was the main house where he stayed, and I stayed in a little guest house, and gorgeous pool with the view of the ocean, and just epitome of luxury and pristine, pure energy. It's just like, wow, this is awesome. And I did not have the power to get myself there. Not at all. But he did. So he, like I said, elevated me so I could experience what life was like in that band of attention. And it was awesome. It was this wonderful gift that gave me something to aspire to. And I'm not talking about the money. I'm talking about the pristine energy and clarity that was available there. But then, the trip ended and I got sent back to my tiny little apartment and then had to go through my own struggles. At one point I punished myself and moved into this horrible little basement for 3 weeks until I woke up and realized, okay, yeah, I don't need to self-flagellate, and I moved into a better place. So we have this ability, and my mistake that I made is I stopped being honest with myself. I lost my humility. I became under the delusion that I could just keep lifting up somebody over and over and over again. And they weren't doing the work. Every time they would fall in the hole, I would just be there to soothe and lift and elevate them out. Because I was under the delusion that I had that kind of power. And what I learned is we can't control anyone. I know this lesson, I've told it to you before, but I have to hear it again. And we can't control people even through love any more than we can through fear. So I guess I had to go through this exercise to learn that even through love, you can't control somebody. It's just not possible. And so at that point, I had to make the decision to be like, okay, that does not belong in my world anymore. And I closed that door. And I want to make very clear that this has absolutely nothing to do with this other person. Because again, I have no control over anybody. On this path, we can only control our own focus of our own mind. And in doing so, we influence our behaviors and actions. And what I noticed is when I was indulging in that behavior, I threw the I Ching to kind of help me wrestle with my issues that I was going through, and it gave me this one line that still sticks with me. It said, belligerent and stubborn ways can be given up without regret. And I had to sit with that for a little while because I'm like, well, it has nothing to do, because of course the mind goes like, oh yes, they're like completely belligerent and stubborn, yes, and be all like pointing it at them, but it's like, that's not how I asked the question. The question was like about me and my behavior. And so I had to really dig deep and say, okay, well, exactly how am I being belligerent and stubborn? And it's like, oh, and that's when that whole concept of honesty and humility opened up. And even though I was ignoring all the signs, like when I would interact with them, I would feel nauseous and headache and just physically. And then after interactions, I would have to spend hours of self-care to pull my energy back up. And if you're with a friend and they're having a really hard time, that's to be expected a little bit. Like, yeah, it's going to be abrasive, but it shouldn't be that much. And I was not being honest with myself. So once I saw that, once I had that crystal clear vision, it's like, okay, this is not aligning with these precepts that I have dedicated my life to. And so I have to change. And so I made that change. And I wish them the absolute best, and I leave that door open for change, because while I can't change anybody, I can't control anybody, I do recognize that people do change. And it was also a wonderful lesson in letting go of nostalgia. Because even if they were to completely change and turn around and 108% devote themselves to the path, the relationship that we had has not existed in a long time. It only existed in my mind. So even then, it would be a whole new relationship. So I tell you these things so that you can look at the world that you are creating for yourself. So you can look at what you allow to go on within your sphere and decide, is this beneficial? Am I causing harm? Am I allowing others to cause harm? And if so, then you have to recognize that there is definitely karma that is created, that is involved in that. So heavy class today. But what this has really taught me is the world I live in is a comedy. That's just how I'm wired. English teachers talk about stories are always either a tragedy or a comedy. Any story that is written, any story that we live. And that's all we are, right? Are these stories. And just looking at my mind so deeply this past week, is it really became evident that I'm just wired for comedy. Like even the classic Shakespearean tale of Hamlet, the end where everybody dies. My mind doesn't end the story there. My mind is like, well, somebody's still there because they're told the story. So that person walked in and found everybody dead, and then they lived happily ever after. So that's just me. I'm into comedies. And that's the world I live in. So you can choose. But if you want to exist as part of this organization, as part of my world, then I interact with people who either directly or indirectly live by these 5 precepts. Because not everybody I interact with is a Buddhist, but everyone that is close to me lives from that center of essential goodness. And that is just the world that I live in, and that's the world I wish to promote and see more of in this world. So if we go back to thinking about the many worlds that all intersect, the theory is that if we create very strong worlds built on this essential goodness, then that creates a ripple effect, right? It creates a sanctuary for others who want that as well. And then they come together, and it makes a difference on this relative plane. It doesn't mean that, we live in this like bubble of separation, because we're always going to be interacting and interfacing with worlds upon worlds upon worlds. But it allows us to create a very strong base that is a source of constant renewal. So I highly recommend it. And I appreciate each and every one of you who is on this journey with me, who is actually doing the work and devoted to this ideal. So thank you for being here. So do you guys have any questions or comments? Is there anything you want to add, subtract? Yes.
I feel like every story is both a tragedy and a comedy depending on your perspective. Because I know someone and we'll see the same thing and I find it hilarious. I was just on the phone with this person this morning and they were telling me this story, this horrible thing that happened, and they were so upset with themselves. And I thought it was hilarious. Not that they were upset, but I was thinking if that had happened to me, it's just so absurd that it's funny. And I'm sure that there are times when I'm acting like something's just so tragic when it could actually be hilarious.
Yes, that's very true. I suppose it depends on where the story ends, right?
Yeah.
It's like, where do you give up? Or if you give up. I just remember my teacher saying, he had it on very good authority that it all works out in the end. So if it hasn't worked out yet, it's not the end. And I subscribe to that belief, which helps me also find the funny. Even when I'm in the throes of oh, this is so horrible. But thank you. Oh, we got somebody in the chat.